legislation, the constitutional right that are the legislative responsibility for businesses to then contact businesses. And when we last week spoke about the statutory law, the law that stipulates the right for businesses to engage with businesses. And then in this discussion with the constitutional right that businesses acknowledge their legislative responsibility in. So it's one thing for business to acknowledge legislation in all that the office business holds business on. But it's another thing for businesses to acknowledge their constitutional right. Their right to acknowledge all the rights in accordance to legislation. Then, therefore, the legislative court of law would say the statutory law that then stipulates how businesses then respond to contact other businesses that they learn from part of the same business departmental structure that we have mentioned in one of our previous videos. And when we have mentioned the business departmental structure and how businesses hold business in the calculation law, the law that calculates one baby born on earth on a daily basis, the law that calculates how the computerized act are then in one legislative acknowledgement with the legislative law. And once the law calculates in all accuracy, and the law has a right to respond in all legislative acknowledgement, then the Calculation Act, under the constitutional right that countries have to provide for one household, for one family member, then the constitutional law are the law that stipulates the statutory right that countries have to then represent themselves in the court of law when the courts of law are against the parliamentary office decision making in a country. And when the country overrule their right, and when the country don't respond to the constitutional right that they have to implement fair processes, to provide for all households in accordance to legislative responsibility, legislative acknowledgement, and when countries and parliamentary houses overrule their constitutional right, then parliamentary officers find themselves against the legislation. And when you find yourself against legislation, and you have to explain yourself in a computerized office that are built in your country and that all parts of human reactions are acknowledged on. And then when mankind or when a country finds themselves explaining the computerized program that a human brain cannot explain, the Bible would say. The Bible would say because the human brain does not realize the plans that God the Heavenly Father has for the decision at hand. The Bible would say because the roads built on earth are different. The Bible would say because God's ways, mankind, are not your ways in how the earth are built. And only in accordance to your legislative responsibility, there are constitutional rights, there are biblical rights. And then to uphold the right hand in acknowledgement to the stipulated law that are the statutory law. The law that presents, like we educate on our Vogue Fashion Instagram pages, the law that presents and represents itself in its introduction. I write apostrophe the introduction. And when the law presents and represents itself and defends itself in its own day, then as parliamentary officials, we have a right to acknowledge our legislative responsibility, to acknowledge how accurately the legislative courts of law are then required to respond to. How accurately the parliamentary office then have a responsibility to respond to the legislative court of law, to the principle of fairness. And when countries have a constitutional right, and then the countries, like we've mentioned in one of the previous videos, have a constitutional right of defense, a statutory right of protection, a statutory right to present and to represent and to defend in all acknowledgement. And when a business like my Evoke business that have walked such a great calculation journey under the office business calculation, and when you go to my LinkedIn page, Ribea Elise, and you see all the businesses that I've been employed at in human resources, and you see how calculatedly accurate the journey have acknowledged the communication office that are my Evoke business. And you see how in all accuracy, me, Queen Ribea Elise in the room, have been introduced to all the business directors in acknowledgement to the office business responsibility that while me, Queen Ribea Elise in the room, are the office business computerized program, and not only a Chinese computerized program, not only how I'm born Queen Ribea in the womb, not only a Rabia Muslim process, but Ribea in all acknowledgement, in all legislative responsibility, in all that has been built. The Bible says in Genesis 1 verse 7, me, Queen Ribea, is the seventh baby. In all that were implemented. The Bible would say in all that the earth respond to Genesis 1 verse 7, the heavenly calculation, the under the sea calculation, as well as all that were built on earth. And then in all accuracy, the Calculation Act that we have been introduced to in our 100 years, then introduces in all accuracy. And when a business like me, Ribea Elise, or Queen Ribea Elise's Evoke business sounds like almost nothing on your human ears, while the introduction was so greatly in all its business responsibility, while the introduction that I was introduced at different businesses and were in all legislative responsibility, legislative acknowledgement, acknowledging the office business telephone line that I meet Queen Ribea Elise's Evoke telephone line. And that was not only the very first computer in a Chinese country many years ago, like the Bible writes, my Queen Mom Universe and a George Philander's name, Anna the prophet, the prophetic journey. It was not only a prophecy. It was implemented in all accurate calculation and responsibility. The Bible says Anna the prophet, mama of wisdom, in all intelligence, that the computerized program were built and that the human being were acknowledged in the same journey's communication line. And then we're not only talking about the telephone signal, and we're not only talking about the satellite, and we're not only talking about the star communication in an American celebrity house that someone was employed in many years ago. Like me, Ribea Elise always say in this New Zealand house, American television are where my Queen Mom Universe and a George Philander are at in the computerized communication in it. Where Queen Mom Universe and a George Philander once built a complete computerized communication, and the communication were then greatly in our years born in South Africa. Where me, Queen Ribea Elise, were born 22nd 11, 1983 in all color acknowledgement introduction. And while the introduction was great, and while the journey introduced, And then our constitutional right, Queen Sana George Philander always used to say, the onus, the responsibility, then belongs to all of us on earth to uphold our right hand in all that we were introduced on our journeys. Me, Queen Ribea, Elise, can uphold my right hand and say, I have been introduced to my mama in all great acknowledgement. I do realize now that my mama, Queen Mom Universe, part of the womb, that my mama was not only a name, Anna, that my mama's surname are not only George State in America, that my mama have introduced me to my mama's brothers and sisters, that my mama's oldest brother, King Pop Universe Ankom Chafter George, that was a pastoral leader now in Sirius for all his 90 years, was greatly introduced to me. That my mama's sister, Queen Auntie Fan, was greatly introduced to me. That my mama's legislative brother, King Pop Universe Ankom Johan George, were greatly introduced to me. In all acknowledgement, in all that we have to be responsible on earth on. That my mama's mama, Queen Grandma Martha, came to Bontebok Street to also not have the courts of law being questioned by also introducing her to the children keys. While she was for years staying at the house where she was staying while she was still a little girl. And while the computerized communication works so in all accuracy with us, and while we are so born in all accuracy, then Queen Mom Universe Grandma Martha came to our Bontebok Street house many years ago to kindly acknowledge all that we can acknowledge on our journeys. That kindly as human beings we have been introduced to the computerized communication that have built so greatly. That are so in one with our human reactions. That kindly Nibblebirds directors can say that they have been introduced to me, Queen Ribea, Elise, on the journey. That kindly Menzies Aviation, that are the most international important airports, can say that their director have come from all the way from Australia. He flew to be introduced to me, Queen Ribea, Elise, in the office in New Zealand. That kindly in my Evoke business, they can all say that they have been introduced. In all legislative responsibility. The Stamford Plaza owner flew all the way from Malaysia, Singapore to come and be introduced to me in Auckland, New Zealand. And in all that legislation respond to, our legislative right are to acknowledge that there are rights. And then, therefore, the legislative court of law would say, that there are stipulated rights. There are the right that then reacts and respond to the constitutional right. There are the statutory law that then reacts to the constitutional right that we have to acknowledge our responsibility. And then therefore, on all acknowledgement, the responsibility that we have learned to uphold our right hand, to acknowledge legislation, to implement that are fair, that are right, and to then therefore be presenting and representing in all acknowledgement. And when your representation falls short, and then it feels in your house's grocery cupboard like you, the human being, falls short. And therefore, in all that the constitutional right have a right to acknowledge and to introduce. And then as business directors, business owners, we have a right to legislatively acknowledge all that we have been introduced. Like me, Queen Ribea, say on my website, evoke.wordpress.com. Anna Prada, Bia Versace, in all that were introduced, Anna Antoinette, in all that were introduced in our years. And when such legislative updates are sensitive in all acknowledgement, then it's in all fairness, in all that has been introduced, that kindly our family have been introduced on earth in our years. And when you have been introduced, my dear, then the years becomes lighter. Like I've mentioned in one of the previous videos, many years ago, South Africa was the most calmest, quietest country. The years becomes lighter. The computerized pressure on the human brain becomes lighter. In accordance to all its introduction, in accordance to all its green ticks, it becomes lighter on the human brain. Like I educate on my Evoke business, it becomes lighter on all that we find ourselves doing in our journeys. And therefore, with HR 2025-2026, business restructuring with me, Ribea, Elise, we want to hold on to the constitutional right for businesses to make contact with businesses. The statutory law for businesses to implement fair acknowledgement. There are the principle fairness. For businesses to legislatively adhere to their responsibility under the calculation law, there are the legislative responsibility. There are the legislative right for countries to have fair processes. For countries to not miss an Evoke business in the middle of such an important communication line that acknowledges such an important journey. For countries to acknowledge all that they have learned about the office business computerized communication line. To acknowledge all that they learn that the communication line requires them to then respond to. And then therefore, once you learn that your country have a legislative right to respond and to acknowledge, and once you learn that your country have a constitutional right to be defended in all that it have to acknowledge under the computerized office, and when you learn that your country have a statutory law that cannot change for any reason. When you learn that your country have a statutory law, a law that cannot change for any reason other than the legislative responsibility that it has to respond to. And then you learn to acknowledge all that the legislative law requires you to respond to. And then you learn to acknowledge all that the legislative court of law represents in its day. And when the legislative court of law represents so much, there are all that we are doing being human beings on earth. And then it's just fair and it's just right for countries to do their processes right in all acknowledgement. And there are the constitutional right. And while we conclude on this day's discussing. And while we have greatly been introduced, and while we have a right to do right, and then the legislative court of law would say, let us uphold our right hands and do right. Let us therefore do right in all that we have learned that are right. Under the constitutional right, under the statutory unchangeable law, under the calculation right, under the legislative responsibility. The legislative responsibility that are their accordance to legislation. The legislative responsibility reads accordance to legislation, in accordance to legislation, in accordance to legislation. In no other way other than the statutory right that cannot divert off of this or that in accordance to legislation. In accordance to legislation. The legislative court of law have a right that are right. In all that the legislative court of law have a right on, then let us learn to do right. And let us then, in accordance to the statutory law, not divert off of, not get a different direction in what we are doing. But in accordance to the statutory law, let us learn to then therefore do right. And our constitutional right that we then find ourselves having defense in times of wars when we are in oppressions or in aggressions. Let us then, therefore, hold on to our legislative right. And that with this week's HR 2025-2026 Business Restructuring with me, Ribea Elise.